welcome to everyone, and we're ready to start. My name is Shannon Lozinski. I'm the Director of Patient Services at the Chordoma Foundation, and I would like to welcome all of you to the Expert Answers webinar, where today we'll be talking about making decisions on clinical trial participation. And we're expecting a number of participants today from a number of countries. We've got US, Canada, Israel, Australia, UK, Brazil, Switzerland. My apologies if I missed anyone, but we're thrilled to have all of you with us today. Before we get started, I want to remind everybody that the webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the Foundation's website. I'm going to be moderating the webinar today, and I'd like to welcome and introduce our speakers. We have Dr. Katherine Thornton, who is the Clinical Director for the Center of Sarcoma and Bone Oncology at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. And just down the road from her, also in Boston, is Dr. Cote, a medical oncologist at the Stephen L. Harris Center for Chordoma Care at Massachusetts General Hospital. And both of the fine doctors are members of the Foundation's Medical Advisory Board, and we're very glad to have them here to talk with us today. So in just a few moments, I will turn things over to them, and Dr. Thornton will be speaking first about the basics of clinical trials, how to find them, and when they are good options for chordoma patients. And Dr. Cote will then spend some time talking about the actual process of enrolling and participating in a trial and sharing some examples of what that's like. Following the doctor's presentations, there'll be time for a Q&A session. So I want to talk for a minute about how we will do that. Many of you submitted questions during the registration process for the webinar, and so we have those on hand, and they are ready to be asked. If any further questions come up during the doctor's presentations, you can send those to us using the Q&A feature in the chat window on the right side of your screen. So you'll see that you click on the Q&A feature, then you can type your question in here and click Ask Question. Please note that if you do it this way, your name will be shown along with your question, and all participants will be able to view that. If you wish to send a private question to us privately, you can go to the chat feature and then choose Private here and send a message directly to Chase. And she's sitting here with me, and so we will get those and be able to ask those to the presenters. We expect there to be quite a few questions, so in order to answer as many as possible, we'll consolidate similar questions into one. And we also want to be careful not to ask questions that are too specific to an individual person's current situation, since the doctors can't give medical advice here, and we want to make sure the information in the webinar applies to as many people as possible. And if you should experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please send a private chat to Jen Roeder. She's from our communications team, and she'll be able to assist you. She's also listed in the private chat window. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Dr. Thornton.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to thank Shannon and Josh Summer and the Chordoma Foundation for inviting Dr. Cote and I to give this presentation to you guys and hopefully help answer some questions. So, first and foremost, what is a clinical trial and how do I know if one is right for me? Well, I'm thinking of this as sort of a clinical trials 101 sort of course, and I will try to answer some just very general questions when people are kind of contemplating the landscape that's out there. It's helpful just to know the basics. So what's a cancer clinical trial? Well, just quite simply, it's a research study involving people. The studies try to answer scientific questions and find better ways to prevent, diagnose, and ultimately treat cancer. And not all trials are created equal, and that's what I'm hoping to help demonstrate. So where does everything start? Well, invariably, it usually starts in the laboratory. We'll have a drug, something that I'll call drug X, that looks like it might work in mouse chordoma models or in vitro or test tube kinds of situations. But of course, mice and humans are not the same thing. So we don't know whether that drug will work in a human being. And so there's various types of clinical trials that'll help answer these questions. Those clinical trials start off with what are called phase 1 trials, and then go up to essentially phase 4 trials. And I'm going to try to break those down a little bit so that you guys can all understand them a little bit better. So phase 1 trials, quite simply, want to look at, is the drug that we've just tested in the laboratory, is it safe in humans? They're looking for safety and potentially, the side effects that humans might experience from going onto the drug. And they're also looking at what's the appropriate dose, because, so far the drug hasn't been tested in human beings, so we don't know what the appropriate dose is. The wonderful thing about phase 1 trials is that they tend to be, because they're the first sort of foray usually into human patients, they often are very open-ended. And so, with the chordoma population specifically in mind, it's a chance for patients that might not be eligible for other clinical trials to sort of enter the clinical trial arena and have their disease included. They're usually open to many different tumor types, all within one study. So that kind of adds accessibility to the mix. After a phase 1 study has been completed and we now know, okay, how safe is drug X? How is it work? How are patients tolerating it? Then we usually will move over to phase 2 studies. In the phase 2 studies, again, we'll demonstrate how safe is the drug in a more broader population, and also will typically be a little bit more disease focused. So this is where we're generally going to find our chordoma specific trials, trials that are geared just towards chordoma patients. Sometimes chordomas patients are included into different sarcoma trials because chordoma sort of falls under the sarcoma umbrella. But these are more disease specific trials. They usually involve higher numbers of trials. Phase 1 trials might only have, up to 30 patients in a trial, whereas a phase 2 might go up to a couple of hundred patients if there's enough patients to actually go into the study. Very few of these trials will move on beyond the phase 2 setting, and that's really important for chordoma patients because there's just not a lot of you guys out there. So, phase 3 trials, which are the next kind of trial that I wanted to discuss, these usually have hundreds of patients, and these are what usually leads to drug approvals. So, I'm usually happy if I can find a great phase 2 for my patient that is looking at a particular drug or immunotherapy or, targeted therapy that is specific to them. And, if I don't end up capturing a phase 3 trial, that's okay. I'm equally as happy with the phase 2. Usually phase 3 trials, because they're going to lead to a drug approval, will be comparing the drug to a standard of care or a placebo. So speaking of placebos, what are common fears that I hear from patients all the time about clinical trials? Well, patients will come in and say to me, am I going to be treated as a guinea pig? I don't want to be a guinea pig. Or is there a possibility that I'll be randomized to a placebo? What I usually will say to my patients is, listen, every drug that we have out there started with clinical trials. So I understand that fear of being the guinea pig, but we don't end up making advances in the field without having patients enter these clinical trials. So if there's ever the opportunity to do so, it's such a great opportunity for the patient and for future patients down the road. Some patients' studies are randomized to placebos. Many times that may not be the right thing for a patient. If the patient is having a tumor that's sort of rapidly progressing, then taking the risk of getting randomized to a placebo isn't going to be likely a good venture. On other hand, there's trials that are randomized to placebos where there's such frequent check-ins that if something isn't working, there's the opportunity to try to cross over to the active treatment. And so, I have conversations with my patients all the time as to whether a particular trial that might have that kind of design set up is a good risk for them. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And of course, there's just that common, understandable fear of, well, gosh, what if this just doesn't work? Not all of these trials are home runs and hitting the target. And so, just staying in close proximity and close dialogue with your oncologist is really helpful in wading through that fear and that realm. So how do people find a clinical trial specific to chordoma? Well, the Chordoma Foundation is a fantastic tool and for helping patients navigate through this very difficult and overwhelming field sometimes. So their website, and I've posted just a screenshot from their clinical trials catalog, will list all of the trials that are currently ongoing that are specific to chordoma patients, and they're constantly updating this. I can't do it within the slide presentation right now, but I could actually click on any one of those studies and it'll bring me to a link that will show me where that study is taking place. And you can even get into clinicaltrials.gov, which will sometimes, most of the time, give you the eligibility and ineligibility criteria for a trial. And then there's another screenshot that will go on to more of those phase 1 types of studies, or studies that might be in the phase 2 world, but open to all kinds of patients, allowing chordoma patients and rare tumors an ability to enroll. So I really find, almost more than clinicaltrials.gov, which I use all the time, I find for chordoma patients in specific, the Chordoma Foundation website to be a really wonderful tool. So just to kind of give an example of a patient of mine, this is a de-identified patient case, but I have a patient, he's a 54-year-old man. I've been following him for years for what was primarily a skull-based chordoma. He had received prior radiation and prior surgery approximately 10 years ago, and unfortunately had developed progressive disease. The first thing that we did when I was caring for him is we got him back in with his surgeons, and we got him back in with the radiation oncologist. Fortunately, he was not having a lot of symptoms. We were really picking up his progression because of radiographic changes. And so surgery was not an option for him because of where his tumor was located and the surgical and brainstem architecture that was around where his tumor was. And radiation had otherwise really been maxed out. So we decided to seek a clinical trial. He was in excellent health. He, continued to work full time and be a really active guy. Other than his disease, he wasn't really inhibited in any major way. He did have a history of Crohn's disease. And so when we started looking for clinical trials, we came up with a bunch of immunotherapy trials, and there was an immunotherapy trial at the National Cancer Institute that he was interested in. But when we went through the eligibility criteria, we found that because of his history of Crohn's disease, he would have been ineligible for that study because Crohn's disease is an autoimmune problem, and autoimmune problems would be excluded from that study. So we saved him a trip down to the NCI, and we otherwise enrolled him into another clinical trial that was open to chordoma patients, and he was able to go on a more targeted therapy. So, this is sort of how we navigated that field. And fortunately, he responded well and is still, continuing on the treatment that he ultimately went on. But if he's to have a recurrence later on down the road, then we'll revisit what the options are at that time. So that's sort of a whirlwind tour of just, clinical trials in general and how to sort of, kind of flesh them all out and figure out which ones are best for you. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Greg Cote, to talk about what one can expect from clinical trial participation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Katie. That was great. So as you heard, I'm a medical oncologist, and I spend most of my time taking care of patients with sarcoma and chordoma. And from a research standpoint, I also, in addition to writing trials for sarcoma and chordoma patients, I work in the phase 1 group. What I was tasked with today was to discuss what you might expect from participation in a clinical trial. I'll apologize in advance. I have a bit of a post-viral cough, so if you hear me mute for a few seconds, that's just me coughing offline. So once you and your doc have figured out a trial that you might be interested in, the first step is something called informed consent. So what's that? So a consent form is a large document. Usually it's 20 to 30 pages. It's written in sort of a lay, non-medical language so that you might understand it better. And in that document, it goes through what the drug is that's being looked at, who's sponsoring the study. So the sponsor might be a pharmaceutical company that has this new drug they want to look at in patients, and they're looking for patients and investigators to help with that. Or it could be somebody like Katie or me who wrote this study, and we're leading it. The document will also include the known side effects of the drug. If it's a new drug in phase 1, we might only know a handful of side effects. If it's an approved drug for a different kind of cancer, and now we're looking at it in chordoma, there might be a long list of known side effects because it's possible thousands of people might have been treated. Also in that consent form, there's some language covering the schedule, and we'll get into that a little later. And then also information to protect your privacy. Now, a consent form, even though it's a large document that you might sign, it's non-binding. So once you sign that document, it's not like you're not legally contracted to participate in the trial. At any point, you could change your mind and de-enroll from the trial. So I've had patients sign these consent forms and then think about it, process it over a week, and then change their mind, and that's okay. And getting back to that guinea pig statement, participants in a clinical trial are definitely not guinea pigs. Guinea pigs don't have a choice. Patients who participate in trials do have a choice to participate. So once you go through all the information, if you decide it's not right for you, it's okay to change your mind. So if that looks good and you sign off on the consent form, the next step is something called screening. So for any given trial, there's a list of eligibility criteria to make sure the patient's a good fit for that study. So this might be patient has the correct disease, they don't have a lot of other medical problems that might make the trial dangerous. It could be some issue with the scheduling. So we go through all these things. There might be blood tests, EKGs, repeat scans, and if everything looks good, we go through our check boxes, and a patient, if they are eligible, can be registered for the clinical trial. And then once that process is set, then we go on to the treatment part of the study. Now, the schedule for these studies is quite different depending on what type of trial you're looking at. So for a phase 1 study, so these are the first in human studies, first time the drug's ever been given to a person, they tend to be quite busy. Some of this is research oriented, where we're giving the drug and we need some extra visits and blood draws to measure the level of the drug in the patient. Other visits are for safety, making sure things are okay. We're doing a lot of EKGs at different time points, usually with the blood draws looking at the drug levels to make sure there's no safety issue there. And sometimes these studies also will add in a biopsy that might be required to see what the drug's doing to the tumor. In general, this is not universal, but in general, the extra long visits and days are kind of stacked up early in the study. So it might be a busy first month, but then the second month might be less intense. I'm going to skip 2 slides ahead just to give you an example of a patient I actually saw today. This is a 67-year-old man with again, a tumor of the clivus, so the sort of the bottom of the skull. And I've known him for a long time. We've gone through a lot of treatments, and he's was very interested in this phase 1 study. So this is quite busy. You'll note that, so we call these cycles. So this is the period of treatment in these studies, and this is a twice per week IV infusion. So very already off the bat inconvenient schedule. You'll note on day 1, he received the treatment in some research labs and had to stay in the infusion center for 12 hours. And during that time point, he had 8 different blood draws. He had to come back on day 3 for a quick blood draw, and then was back on days 4, 8, and 11 with labs, an exam with me, and then again an infusion. So 3-hour visits. So not a great schedule. Back on day 15 again for another 12-hour day, and then a short day on day 18. So these are busy studies. They're not right for everyone, and it's really important to think about that schedule as you might be considering a phase 1 study. Why might somebody be interested in this? Well, as you heard from Katie, these are cutting-edge drugs, and it's an exciting opportunity for some of our chordoma patients to get access to these that might otherwise be directed towards more common types of cancer. So phase 2, as you heard, is an established drug where the dose is known and the schedule is known. So these tend to be a lot less busy. Occasionally, there'll be some extra blood draws or maybe a research biopsy that might be optional, but in general, they tend to follow the schedule of the IV treatment, of the treatment rather than the extra visits. And then I just want to touch on a couple additional things before we finish up here. So depending on where you are, you might be looking at a new care team. So what do I mean by this? So if you're being treated by an oncologist that doesn't have clinical trials, they might refer you to a different center that does. Even within your own institution, there may be a physician that only takes care of sarcoma and sort of the higher level clinical trials, but then if they want to refer you to phase 1, they might send you over to a different team member. So Kitty and I share a lot of patients, and occasionally she sent me some that are looking for a phase 1 clinical trial. So I might take them for a little bit, and then if that doesn't work, they go back and see her again. There are specialized nurses and infusion nurses that are on this team. So there might be a research nurse who doesn't do much of the hands-on clinical works, but just helps the physician take care of the patient. There are special research infusion nurses, so these are different than the ones that might be giving chemotherapy on a different floor. And then there are research coordinators that kind of help out with all the extra visits because these are quite complex schedules. So there'll be a lot of new faces, but these people are experts on the trial, and they're there to help get you through it. As noted, there's a lot of extra monitoring and dosing, monitoring of the dosing and side effects on these trials. But in particular, if it's an oral drug, we might give you a drug diary to keep track of what you take when you take the drug and what side effects you might be happening. I've had some patients want to fill out that they took the drug every time, even though they might not have, and we don't want that. We want people to be honest because we want to know if they're not taking a drug why that might be. Is there a reason for that? And then lastly, I just want to touch on costs and travel. So in the United States, and I know some people are calling from outside the United States, but in the United States, there's an interesting arrangement where in a clinical trial, the standard of care effort is covered by your insurance. So this might be the doctor visits, some routine labs, the scans, maybe the IV infusion are all covered by insurance. Whereas the experimental part, so the new drug, the extra visits, the extra blood draws, those would be covered by the clinical trial. So what does this mean for you? It means that if your insurance has a deductible or a copay, you still might be responsible for that if you haven't hit your limit. Some trials do have a stipend for travel, most do not, and it's an important thing to factor in when you're considering a study that might involve some travel. Usually the studies that are the phase 1 type studies will have a travel budget for those extra long days, but not all of them. For international patients, at least in the United States, it's quite challenging. The U.S. healthcare is not set up to cover the costs of those patients, and that leads to a lot of out-of-pocket expense, and often can mean that those studies are not realistic options. So it's just something to think about from there. And I think that's my last slide. Yeah, there you go.
Perfect. Thank you so much to both of you. I think that was a lot of really great information, and I think much of it addressed a number of the questions that we have already gotten, but we know that there are more, and so we have a chance now to ask those to you. So I'll put this slide back up here again so that anyone who'd like to enter some questions, if you need a refresh of how you can send those questions to us, we'll leave it there. So first question, I think Dr. Cote, since you were just mentioning this about travel, we have a question that is, why are patients required to go to the clinical trial site for all visits? Couldn't some of the tests be done at a local doctor's office and then sent to the trial doctors?
Yes, that's a great question. So it just depends on how the study is set up and what tests you're talking about. So if a patient's on a trial for a period of time and things are going well, we can definitely add a local lab as a study site. There's some regulatory work for this, but to use those lab values. There may be some trial-specific studies that have to be done at the treating institution. This could be a special research blood draw. I've even seen study sponsors require us to use their EKG machine, even though it's the same EKG that you might get at your primary care office. The trial EKG actually is connected to a database that the sponsor is running, so it has to be their machine. So this is really depends on the trial of interest and how they have arranged it. Usually for the trials that an investigator might write themselves, like if I wrote it or if Katie wrote it, we tend to be as flexible as possible because we know the disease. We know that chordoma patients are traveling from all over, and we don't want to deprive those patients of the opportunity to to participate if they're interested in that. And so we'll often build as much flexibility as we can into those studies. The bigger pharma studies that are asking kind of key questions like in phase 1 or key outcome questions, they might be a little more strict about those visits.
Great, thank you. That was a lot of good information about that. It's a question that we get often. Okay, so next question. How restrictive is eligibility criteria for clinical trials?
I can tackle that one. It depends entirely on the trial. There are some trials that are very open-ended, and it really depends across the phases too. It doesn't tend to follow a certain paradigm, but some eligibility and ineligibility criteria will just require that someone is in what's called good performance status, which is a sort of funny medical way of saying just how healthy and how fit is the patient. And we really look at, how much of the day is the patient kind of awake and doing their normal activities of the day. And so that's one of the major criteria that most clinical trials will have. A lot of them will have criteria with regards to where the blood counts are and are the liver levels normal and the kidney levels, just to make sure that if they're looking at drug metabolism, that that everything is that the patient's able to process the drug correctly, and that they're not going to get too sick from the drug, from it building up too rapidly on them. But I've seen clinical trials where there are eligibility and ineligibility criteria a mile long, and I think, oh my gosh, how is anybody going to get into this trial? And then I'll see ones that are really quite open-ended. And a lot of times, sponsors and the people who are developing these clinical trials shoot themselves in the foot from having so many hurdles for patients to jump over. There's actually a national effort going on right now by the American Academy of Cancer Research, by the American Society of Clinical Oncology, the FDA, the National Cancer Institute, and some patient advocacy groups to try to open the eligibility criteria and make it easier for patients to go on trials. And there's talks ongoing about lowering the age requirements, allowing patients with brain metastasis to go on trials, and really open it up so that patients don't have to jump through quite so many hurdles.
So similarly to that, we know that chordoma trials are often designed for patients with advanced or recurrent disease. So they've already likely had surgery, radiation. But are there any trials for patients who have just had surgery or who don't have recurrent or advanced disease?
Let's see. So there are two trials for patients who've not had resections. One, I believe Katie, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Hopkins study of immunotherapy plus radiation, I think, will allow patients who've not had surgery yet. And then there is coming a vaccine study that will allow patients who've not had surgery to get a vaccine during their initial radiation therapy. For patients who've had surgery and or radiation and are just being followed, I'm not aware of any studies in that indication yet. But depending on how the ongoing studies go now, that could be something of interest to look at.
Yeah, Greg, I think you're right on the two trials that you mentioned. And additionally, all of these trials, until they really are validated and become more of what we would consider standard of care, whether it means an FDA approval or just a validation over several clinical trials so that we're using it commonly in clinics, we really don't know whether a lot of these drugs are better than surgery and radiation. I mean, that really remains the gold standard for primary treatment. So, it may not be the right thing for a patient to go onto a clinical trial and accept what is, in essence, kind of a question mark versus, go down a more straight and narrow path. So most of the primary treatment types of protocols are going to incorporate whatever the experimental treatment is, plus whatever would be considered standard of care. And for most cases in chordoma, it'll be surgery plus or minus radiation. So, it's, and that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind. There's also patients that can't have surgery, for whatever reason. And, I'm seeing a patient currently who's in that sort of conundrum, or they've chosen not to have surgery because the outcome would be so catastrophic for the patient, and they just chose not to go down that path. Sometimes there's eligibility loopholes, if you will, where it will say the patient must have had all standard of care treatment or something like that. And, sometimes we can talk to the clinical trial sponsors, whether it's the pharmaceutical companies or the principal investigators, and say, hey, there really is no standard for this patient. Is this patient eligible to go on?
And I think Dr. Thornton, I've heard you mention this before, the fact that there are all kinds of clinical trials. And here we're talking about kind of specific ones, but there's many trials going on. And if you're having surgery or radiation, your doctor might ask you if you want to participate in a trial that they're involved in, but it's not necessarily, it's not necessarily going to be providing a treatment that isn't available elsewhere, or that, you know, is being studied the same way that the trials that we're talking about. And the clinical trials catalog on the Chordoma Foundation website lists just those trials that are looking at and studying systemic therapies and not surgery or radiation.
Correct.
We have a question. Would you ever advise trials for patients who are stable? Maybe they might have a high risk of recurrence or something like that, but currently have stable disease, or are patients only admitted to trials if they have progressive disease?
Yeah, so it's a good question. My take in the chordoma field right now is that since our therapies are still mostly at the investigational standpoint, at the investigation point, that it probably makes sense if a tumor is not growing and not causing symptoms, just to watch it and kind of get a sense of the rate of progression. I do have a handful of patients in my own practice who have recurrent or metastatic disease that just isn't growing, or if it is growing, is so slow that they don't need any therapy right now. So we're kind of both just waiting for the opportunity where either it starts growing and they need something, or if there's some new trial that comes along that's really exciting, that might be the right one. So I think, you know, it depends on the situation, but most of my patients, if it's stable or there's no evidence of disease, I opt for an observation type strategy.
I agree with Greg 100%. I think an important thing to keep in mind, because I see it so often on all of my patients, not just my chordoma patients, where, you know, even if something's stable, the patient just feels very anxious, you know, just sort of that kind of feeling of waiting for the other shoe to drop. But as we all know, or as many of you might be learning, you know, chordomas can stay stable for really extended periods of time. And unfortunately, these drugs, whether experimental or more researched, they usually have a lifespan. And so, you know, I don't want to start treating a patient who has stable disease with something, and then we're all patting ourselves on the back because the disease is stable, where it probably would be stable if they weren't on that drug. And then meanwhile, we're using up an option that someone might need later on down the road. So I agree with Greg 100%. I usually just, if something's stable, just, you know, keep the patient feeling well, keep them off of therapy, let their bodies, be healthy off of any kind of drugs, and stay strong. And then at the moment that we see something progress, then we can go down that pathway of treatments.
Great, thank you. So another question about deciding on a trial. How should we compare doing a trial versus taking a known approved cancer medication?
Can you repeat that question again, Shannon?
Absolutely. So how would a patient compare the option of going onto a clinical trial versus taking a known approved cancer medication, which I think is a good place to also talk about the fact that there are no approved drugs for chordoma, but maybe for other cancers. And how do you weigh the benefits and risks or the options of both?
It's a great question, and it's one that, you know, Dr. Cote and I grapple with in clinic all the time. So, you know, if there is a patient's, you know, got a progressing chordoma and they're needing treatment, my approach to advocating for my patients is really, if there's a clinical trial available, the patient is logistically able to go on to the clinical trial, and it seems to make sense for their tumor, I am always going to favor a clinical trial over what I'll just put in sort of air quotes right now as standard of care. And I'll talk about that in a second. The things that are approved and available for other diseases, there's really nothing approved for chordoma, unfortunately. But the drugs that are approved for other things that we use in chordoma because of other clinical trials that we've done in the past or case series, those will always be there. So, if there's something that might end up pushing that other drug to the farther back in the list and give them the opportunity to get a novel treatment that may work better than that other thing that's out there, and also just create another treatment option for them, I'm always going to favor that. Where it becomes difficult is in the patient's ability to get to the trials. I may not have a trial that looks reasonable here at my institution. I might reach out to, Dr. Cote and see if he has something, or reach out for a patient that's based in, so let's say the New England area, to the places around here, and there might not be anything. And the closest thing is in, Bethesda, Maryland at National Cancer Institute, or, in New York or something. And the patient may not be able to travel. And so if that's the case, there aren't any clinical trials, and we really want to try to get something to rein back the tumor, that's when I'll reach for the so-called standard of care. Now, what is that so-called standard of care? Well, these are drugs that, we have trials that have been done in the past. We have case series or retrospective studies looking at groups of patients who have gotten these kinds of therapies and they've shown some benefit. These are things that you might have heard of. There's a drug called imatinib. There's a drug called palbociclib. These are all drugs that are actually, have been either looked at in one way or the other, or are currently in clinical trials, but they're approved for other diseases. That's the place where I might reach for something like that.
Greg, did you want to say anything about that?
Yep, no, I completely agree. I think Dr. Thornton said everything exactly the way I approach it. So,
and I think it's good to make the point that the Medical Advisory Board, which both doctors here are members of, our Medical Advisory Board has set out recommendations for patients who are considering systemic therapies, with the first step being to consider chordoma-specific clinical trials. And if those aren't options, then to consider other trials that are open to chordoma patients. And if those still aren't options, then to discuss off-label systemic therapies with a chordoma-experienced medical oncologist. So those all kind of go together. And so Dr. Thornton, you just mentioned the results of clinical trials and what do we know about what has been studied in chordoma before. And we do have a question related to that, that what results of clinical trials are typically made public about what the trial has found, and when does that happen, and how can patients access that information?
Well, the clinical trials, it's a hard question to answer because there's a lot of different directions for the answer. Clinical trials, as far as when the data is made public, it's usually after the data, after the trial has closed and the information has matured, meaning, if it was a phase 1 trial and it's just safety and dosing information, then those kinds of results are usually reported pretty quickly. They may not come out in an actual publication, but they're released at national meetings. Abstracts are created, which are sort of like posters that are hung at meetings, and then that information becomes public. And people like Dr. Cote and I, we go to these national meetings and we soak up all of the information that our colleagues are sharing and that we're sharing. And we come back and we bring that to our patients. And the patient that wants to get on and consult Dr. Google and start kind of looking up information for what's out there, might come across that kind of information. Larger studies that are looking at endpoints like overall survival, sometimes those studies can actually take a while to have the official end results approved, because it takes a long time to get that information. But along the way, those presentations, those sort of interim presentations at different meetings are disclosed, so that the data is sort of brought to the public, and things are updated along the way, which allows us to get a little bit earlier glimpse into what we're going to find out. So that's one way of getting it out there. And then a lot of times, a lot of the drugs that we're currently using isn't so much from clinical trials per se, but it may be from, a large center, like the ones that Dr. Cote and I are at. We might pull all of our patient information and write a paper just based on what's called retrospective data, and then publish that, just because we see that there is a signal when we use such and such drug, and we see that it looks like it's benefiting our patients. We want to get that word out there. Fortunately and unfortunately, the Chordoma world is a very small one. Fortunately, because from a clinician standpoint, we all sort of know the people who have a particular interest, and we stay in touch with one another. The Chordoma Foundation links us all together in a really positive way. We meet up at national meetings, and we kind of know what's out there, which is a plug for just having patients get involved with a Chordoma specialist, and just being tapped into what is going on out there. It's unfortunate, obviously, for the reasons that we're all well acquainted with, is that in a small world, it's really hard to do clinical trials, and that becomes a challenging thing. But that's what we're all up for, the challenge.
One thing I'd like to add is that a new feature on the clinicaltrials.gov website is that when a study's complete, they're now asking the sponsor to put up interim results. So that is another place that you can search for results.
Yeah, that's a great addition.
Great. So speaking of doctors knowing what trials are available, are medical oncologists the only type of doctors who can help patients find clinical trials? And if patients are not close to a Chordoma experienced doctor who is in our small Chordoma world, what can they do about that? Is there any way that that their doctor could consult with another, or how can they find this same information that you're talking about knowing from colleagues?
Yeah, so let me take the second question first. So if I work with a lot of community doctors, I think most sarcoma specialists do. We think in general this disease should be, every patient with this disease should at least be evaluated by a center with expertise. It's such a rare tumor that there's a lot of nuance that a community doc might not have, and moreover, they may have never seen a chordoma before or other types of sarcomas. So I tend to have and I know Dr. Thornton has the same network, but we tend to work with community docs who will refer us patients with unusual tumors. We give a recommendation, and if the patient can't be treated at our center, they will travel back to the community doc, and we'll work together with them. And what that takes to be successful is a community oncologist who's willing to have a back and forth with the specialist, and together we can carry out that treatment. If travel's not possible because of clinical reasons, then probably the best thing to do would be to have the private oncologists reach out through the Chordoma Foundation for one of the medical oncologists on the advisory board. And I think any of us would be happy to talk to a community doc to help guide them on the decision making. For the first question about clinical trials, yeah, we recognize in this community that really challenging to navigate all the trials. If you go to clinicaltrials.gov and try to find a study that might be applicable to your type of cancer, it can be a little overwhelming. There's been a revamp of that website, and it's a little better than it used to be, but it's still pretty difficult to navigate. I think that what we're seeing a lot in the oncology field is this navigator position, where it's somebody doesn't have to be a medical oncologist, but somebody who can help guide patients to different treatment areas and different clinical trials. And that's what the Chordoma Foundation is trying to do with the website and their team there.
I agree. And the only addition I would add to that, Greg, and you may have said this, but I just spaced, but a lot of the places where Chordoma clinicians are located do have the ability to do remote consults. And so if you call to sort of make an appointment, and you tell the schedulers, hey, look, I really can't get there because I live in, India, or I live in, remote Canada, and I'm just not going to be able to get down there. There's the ability to kind of go on and submit scans and everything through a remote, and it kind of almost gives you sort of the in-person experience without actually coming down here.
Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah, there's some private companies now that do this with like video chat as well. So there's a lot of like really neat options out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great idea.
And I think if I understand correctly about those, we're talking about remote consultation services that would apply to off-label therapies, but not clinical trials, that there really is not a way. We're having a couple questions right now about long-distance drug trials. And as far as I know, I don't think that's possible, but I certainly would like to hear from both of you about that.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, for the clinical trial, you have to be seen and the drug dispensed from or given from the site that's running the trial. Some studies are run through a single institution. Others involve multiple institutions. So it just depends on which trial and how it's run. Most pharmaceutical companies will try to have an investigational site covering different regions of the United States, sometimes outside of the United States, so that they can have the opportunity to look for patients.
Great. Okay, so a lot of times, many trials require a tumor sample of some kind when determining if the patient's eligible. And if there's not a lot of tumor tissue available, biopsies with chordoma sometimes can be risky or not advised. Do you have any advice for how patients should, if they're looking at different trials and only have a small amount of tissue to be used to determine eligibility, just how would they best go about that?
So yeah, it's most of the time there's a handful of companies that will do. I think what they're asking is about sort of next generation sequencing or genetic sequencing of tumor, and there's a handful of companies across the world, but the ones that I'm familiar with are in the US that can do this and generate a report, which might be helpful when it comes to looking for clinical trials or sort of helping guide a patient down a particular patient pathway. It's challenging when there's only a certain amount of tissue, and as you mentioned, Shannon, it's some of the locations of our chordoma tumors are really difficult to biopsy, but these samples can be taken from archival tissue samples and run from those old biopsies. they actually don't require a whole heck of a lot of tumor. Greg might have more specifics, but it's something like, 40 nanograms or something very, very, very minute. So it can be a real challenge when someone's only had a needle biopsy performed. But if there's enough tissue, that sometimes it's amazing what can be done off a very, very small sample. With that said, there is nothing clinically validated with next generation sequencing yet. So, I would not put a patient, my own personal thoughts is I would not put anybody through any kind of risky procedure to get tissue that may ultimately not be helpful. So it's something that if a patient has tissue, the results might be interesting in order to help guide one towards a particular clinical trial, but it's not something that I would risk anybody's health over at this juncture.
Yeah, and then I think one part of the question they were getting at was whether if that tissue is required for eligibility for a trial, and that's a really hard question. I've struggled with that myself, and what that comes down to is if you have a limited amount of tissue, there's a trial of interest, the patient and the doc have to have a heart-to-heart discussion about how badly they want to participate in this trial. Is it worth the risk of depleting the sample? That being said, even though there is some risk with seeding with chordoma biopsies, and the patient who already has metastatic disease, if the biopsy is done carefully with a small needle, it can be done safely. It just needs to be done by somebody who knows what they're doing.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we have time, I think, for just one more question. So it's kind of a two-part question. I'm trying to get two answered at the same time, I think. But what has been the most effective clinical trial for chordoma to date? And then from any past and current clinical trials, have we identified yet any active pharmacological treatment options for chordoma?
Well, I'm not sure. I can't remember who's up to tackle the question, but I can.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and start? That's fine.
Okay. Have there, Shannon? It's a two-part question. One part was, is there anything like what's been the most successful to date? And then I'll tackle that one, and then I'll have you tell me what the second part is. So, okay. That's I guess it just depends in what way you're looking at that question and trying to formulate an answer. Is there anything out there that, in my eyes, something that I would want to say this is really successful is that thing that really helps our patients. And although there are a number of agents out there, there certainly hasn't been any home runs in my eyes. Some of the previous really interesting clinical trials I thought were, some of the trials looking at the tyrosine kinase inhibitors, and some of the drugs by name are imatinib or afatinib, lapatinib. There's a whole slew of words that end with IB. I think those have been successful studies because A, they've been done. B, although the information that was gleaned from it wasn't a home run by any means, it really brought a lot to light on the biology of chordomas, what kind of targets there were. It led to other clinical trials combining those drugs with some other more cytotoxic kinds of chemotherapy. So when one says successful, as a clinician trying to find trials for my patients, I think some of those trials were some of the more successful ones. I think what likely is meant by the word successful is, what drug out there has given the best response. And, I think that really is still just kind of remains a question mark. Because just these large trials have really not been done to date. And then what was the second part of the question, Shannon? Well,
I think you answered it pretty well there right at the end. Just is from any trials that have been done in the past or are currently going on now, have we identified anything that is really looking like a good treatment option?
I think some of the things I'm most excited about right now is, not even really so much from clinical trials, but it's what's spiriting a lot of the clinical trials that are looking at immunotherapy agents. And it's just from some of the anecdotal reports, just the case reports that we're hearing, kind of one-off situations where a chordoma patient got into an immunotherapy trial and, ended up having a response. And that's sort of garnered some of the new trials that are ongoing in immunotherapy. And I think it's a really interesting direction for the chordoma world to head in. And I'll be curious to see what our clinical trials end up finding out.
Yeah, I would agree with those points. I think we're all waiting for this big drug to really have a high impact on the clinical course of our patients, and we just haven't seen that yet. But the excitement's out there. There are a lot of really good trials going on, particularly in Europe. There's a study with this drug called palbociclib and this other drug called afatinib that both look really interesting. And then in my phase 1 world, we have a lot of really interesting compounds that kind of hit cancers from these really creative different ways. And I try to get patients onto those studies with chordoma, and maybe it hasn't been studied in a mouse, but it's a really neat mechanism. And my hope is that some of these are going to hit, and if it does, then there's opportunity for a much bigger study to try to see if it's applicable to other patients. So, no, we haven't seen it yet. I think there's a lot of hope out there and a lot of really interesting studies, and we're all looking for that next big thing that hopefully won't be too far along.
Yes, very much agreed. Good points. Well, our hour has flown by, and I want to thank everybody who gave and submitted such great questions. There are some questions that we didn't get to, and I want those of you, if we did not ask your question, I want you to know that we have been taking notes about questions submitted during the webinar, and then of course we have those submitted during registration, and we will be sure to be in touch with you by email to make sure that we can get you an answer for those questions. Many thanks, of course, to Dr. Thornton and Dr. Cote for being here with us today. You're both excellent resources for the chordoma community and really excellent champions for your chordoma patients and really all chordoma patients. And so we thank you very much for that. All of us at the Foundation would like to thank those of you who joined us today for the webinar, the first webinar we've ever done. Please be on the lookout later today for an email that is asking you to give us feedback on the webinar. Any feedback is appreciated so that we can be sure to make any future webinars, make sure that those are really providing the information that you need. And please remember our free and confidential patient navigation service is always available to provide one-on-one assistance. You can contact us by emailing support@chordoma.org or by going to chordoma.org/request-help. And I am noticing a comment in the chat window about the Chordoma Survivors Facebook group, the private group, and that's a wonderful place for support and information, as well as the Chordoma Foundation's online community, Chordoma Connections. We find patients have really great information for each other. And it's a great place for support. So remember that those are there as well. So thank you all again, and until next time.